Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. My name is Courtney Keogh, and I am the Managing Director of the Nature Investment Hub, a solution space of the Natural Step Canada in partnership with the Smart Prosperity Institute. I'm delighted to be with you here today hosting this inaugural event and joined by my colleague Paige Olmsted and a handful of other leaders who are very active in the conservation finance space and who you'll hear from shortly. And of course, so pleased to have all of you here with us as well. When we come together to talk about conservation, restoration, nature-based solutions, as we do today, as we will today, through the lens of conservation finance, it's imperative that we recognize Indigenous leadership and as settlers acknowledge colonial approaches to conservation and its harms. And it's important that we recognize and be mindful of the land upon which we live and work and respect the diverse cultures, languages, laws, protocols, and traditions of the Indigenous peoples wherever we find ourselves. This afternoon, I find myself in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, a territory covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, and a territory that I call home. I'm grateful for the caretakers of these lands here in Cape Breton and the waters that surround this island upon which me and my family depend to support our fishing livelihood. For the majority of the year, however, I reside and work on the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation in Ottawa, and so it's equally important to me that I acknowledge that here today. I encourage each of you to share in this awareness and acknowledgement and appreciation and invite you to use the chat if that feels comfortable for you. We are here today thanks to the Metcalf Foundation and the ECHO Foundation, whose generous support enabled us to launch the Nature Investment Hub and will be influential in sustaining our efforts. I would also like to express my gratitude for the time and effort contributed to the Hub by David Hughes, Mike Wilson, Paige Olmsted, members of our steering committee, the various other individuals who have played a crucial role in helping to shape its design, and those organizations who have signaled early on their interest in being a partner. Some housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you and posted to our website. We have structured the next 90 minutes to give some context before introducing you to the Hub. We'll then take a step back and have a panel discussion with our guest speakers. After that, we will have a Q&A before closing remarks. To make things easy for you and us, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to type in your questions there throughout the presentation and panel discussion, and we'll do our best to address those during the Q&A section. We also have the chat enabled to add another layer of engagement. Feel free to use it and share your thoughts and insights. It's a great way to connect with other fellow participants and us. However, we understand that everyone has different comfort levels when it comes to multitasking during virtual events. If you prefer a distraction-free experience, I simply invite you to minimize the chat window. So I'd like to begin by offering a bit of context to frame the conversations today. And I could start anywhere, but figured why not last week? We just came out of COP28, where we saw meaningful progress on the climate front. And what I imagine felt really significant for so many of us here today was this joint statement on climate, nature, and people, which really underscores just how connected the climate and biodiversity crises are. Even more relevant to our conversations today is the common objective within this statement to scale up finance and investments for climate and nature from all sources in a, quote, synergetic, dedicated, and progressive manner that ensures the promotion of co-benefits and is done in an inclusive and equitable manner. This leads me to speak a little bit about why this work we're here to discuss today to drive investment in nature is timely, urgent, and relevant. We know that we are facing an unprecedented climate and biodiversity crisis globally and here at home in Canada. And these crises have the potential to erode the very foundations of our way of life, impacting our health, communities, cultures, and economies. Which is why in Canada, we've set bold targets, including protecting 30% of our land and marine areas by 2030. But these targets can't be reached without crowding in a larger amount of capital from a wider range of investors to support activity on the ground. We know that Canada can't afford to underinvest in nature, but the funding gap is too big for governments and philanthropy to carry alone. And just how big, you might ask? The image on your screen in front of you is meant to capture that, showing the funding gap in nature-related spend at a global level, which is also reflective of the size of the gap here at home in Canada, a gap somewhere in the magnitude of 20 billion annually. And the yellow circle is intended to show the capital held by the private sector, which can be unlocked. Of course, there are a number of challenges or barriers that we still need to overcome. And if some of those are reflected here, including a general lack of awareness of how Canada's unique conditions can be adapted to conservation finance strategies, lack of awareness in or lack of projects that are investment ready, meaning that they meet the private sector financial return expectations and or impact goals. It's not always easy to translate environmental benefits into financial returns, as value streams are difficult to capture. And lastly, the challenge of capacity to implement solutions. But because we tend to like to frame the work we do in a way that calls attention to the opportunity we can seize and what we stand to gain from putting our time and energy into it, I've listed a few opportunities here. The first is that this investment we're talking about can play a really important role in empowering Indigenous leadership, fostering economic development in Indigenous communities, and supporting cultural revitalization. The second opportunity is that there is this large untapped potential that exists and growing appetite from a wide range of investors to flow capital into nature positive activities in Canada. The third is that we have some really innovative financial instruments and models here in Canada already, some of which you'll hear about shortly, that could be scaled. And we have an opportunity to create and shape others in a way that really reflects and is responsive to our specific and unique context in Canada. If folks want to read more on the challenges and opportunities, I won't go into them in detail, but we have a number of resources housed on the Hub's website. And I'll ask my colleague, Kiana, to drop the Invest in Nature report from the Smart Prosperity Institute into the chat, should you wish to start there. And so it was really out of these conversations around the challenges and opportunities we see here in Canada that the Nature Investment Hub came to be. A number of leaders consulted agreed that a new multi-stakeholder platform would be of great value. And of course, built into this is an inherent recognition that there are many organizations who have been working within the conservation space for years, trying to move or mobilize the money. And what we believe differentiates the Hub is our focus on addressing challenges at a national scale that we believe individual organizations might not often have the mandate or capacity to focus on themselves. Our North Star, or vision, is that investment in nature grows and aligns with the value and benefits nature creates for communities, cultures, and economies today and for future generations. And to realize this future, we intend to drive a fivefold increase in investment in nature in Canada, together with public, private, philanthropic, and Indigenous leaders, which we believe will effectively scale nature positive activities across the country that support solutions for biodiversity and climate. How we intend to do this is by fostering awareness and learning, which includes knowledge mobilization and tools and guidance development, be that business case for the private sector or how-to guides for initiative leaders looking to design projects and activities in a way that are investable. We also want to build the capacity and willingness to act, which can be achieved by providing a venue for dialogue and action and promoting new creative partnerships to form. And we also want to support action and investment by profiling and amplifying activities through our website and other means, and ultimately create a widely endorsed conservation finance agenda for Canada. And so you might be asking yourself, what does this look like tangibly or concretely? And of course, we would in part look to our partners to answer this, but we could imagine it would look something like a speaker series being set up, written explainers on matters that require greater clarity, a carbon-focused working group, a policy working group to identify widely supported actions to leverage investment. It could be an annual gathering, which we hope to have that would create space for all of the various partners to come together and really co-create solutions for action. But we also imagine it could look something like supporting knowledge mobilization efforts and engagement activities as identified by an Indigenous organization who may want to ensure information on conservation finance is available to communities to help them make informed decisions. Coming full circle back to our mission, we believe by pulling on these levers specifically and allowing others to focus on other levers, such as ecosystem valuation, we can really help to increase the number of nature positive activities and projects, which in turn would reduce transaction costs, reduce risk, and increase the flow of investment. What we heard is a desire to see the hub support Indigenous-led stewardship and conservation, engagement in credible carbon markets, and nature-based solutions in agriculture. So these are very much on our radar, but I want to note that we are open to supporting activities that also fall outside of these three specific focus areas. Regarding our work as it relates to supporting Indigenous stewardship and conservation, as articulated on our website, we intend to do so by invitation. And before moving on, I will give a shout out to Valerie, who's on the line, and the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, as well as the Restore, Assert, and Defend Network, both of whom we will look to collaborate with and identify areas in which we can help promote and advance the important work that they're leading. Your engagement is quite crucial to bringing these transformative ideas to life. And so we are inviting you to partner with us, you being Indigenous nations, organizations, leaders, conservation organizations, and ENGOs, philanthropists, government policymakers at the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal levels, private sector investors, financial institutions, experts, and academics, really wanting to cast the net wide. In return for being a partner, you will have the opportunity to drive tangible outcomes and impact and expand your impact and scale up successful conservation finance solutions. You'll be able to inform policy that we hope will lead to increased investment in nature. You'll be able to access a diverse network of organizations in order to collaborate and gain and share knowledge and expertise. You'll stay informed. You'll develop new skills and knowledge, we would hope, through peer-to-peer information and insight exchange, and increase visibility and credibility. So you might refer to this or see this as a call to harness our power and collective leadership to turn this vision into action. And with that, I will turn it over to folks who are working actively in the field and have a lot of insights to share that will help us on our journey. And I'll start with an introduction of my colleague, Paige. Paige Olmsted is Program Director, Land Use, Nature, and Agriculture at the Smart Prosperity Institute, and also wears a second hat as our Conservation Finance Specialist at the Nature Investment Hub. Over to you, Paige.
Thanks, Courtney. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And a special thank you to the panel. We're going to turn over to our panel conversation. And we've got a few questions that we'll direct to panelists directly. And then, as Courtney mentioned at the outset, there is a Q&A box that you can be submitting questions to. And I'll be asking questions that come from the audience sort of partway through this discussion. So we'll start with our existing questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. And if you have questions specifically for the hub and about its format and how it will function, you're welcome to ask those questions as well. We'll segregate those and ask them answer a few of them at the very end. And if there's lingering questions on the hub specifically, we can follow up after the fact, because we want to take advantage of having this brilliant panel with us here today. So I'm not going to take up too much time introducing everyone individually. Their speaker bios have been linked again, I believe, so you can read all about their wonderful accomplishments. And I'll simply mention everyone by name. So we have Rob Wilson from the Nature Conservancy Canada, who's a Program Director of Conservation Finance. We have Valerie Courtois, who's the Executive Director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. We have Daniel Fuentes, who wears many hats and is joining us representing Carolinian Canada today. We have Manuel Pinuela, who's the co-founder and CEO of Cultivo, which is a nature investment firm we'll be hearing about. And also Andy Day, who is the executive or the CEO of the BC Parks Foundation, has been since its inception. So thank you all. And the way that we're going to start today is I'm just going to go to each of you in turn. I think just the sequence that I just went through, as that's the sequence you're on my screen. And we're going to invite each speaker just to introduce themselves in the way that the work that they do as it relates to conservation finance and sort of what they're either focused on or particularly interested in, and the moment and why this issue is important to them. So I'll turn it over to you, Rob, for your sort of introductory remarks, And Val, we'll come to you next.
Great. Thanks so much, Paige. And thanks everyone for having us and allowing us to be here today. So I work for the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and I'm part of a Nature plus Climate Projects Accelerator group that's been set up within NCC. And we are the largest on-the-ground land conservation group that's sort of securing land and protecting land right across the country. So we're kind of in a unique perspective in this space. I've been working in it for probably over a decade and worked a lot with Paige over the years, many times. And very interested in driving more private capital into the space through nature-based solutions. So we are adopting a whole variety of approaches by which we can engage with various stakeholder groups to bring more capital into the space. And we're not in a position to secure all the land across the country ourselves. So we're looking at other ways of how do you arrange protection, working with a very broad set of stakeholders. And for Canada to achieve its targets, its 30 by 30 targets and the Global Biodiversity Framework targets, we will need Indigenous-led conservation. Will have to be a big part of that as well. I'm sure Valerie will talk to that. And other creative approaches by working with various landowners to incentivize them to conduct best management practices and do what they're often doing very well and continuing that. So that's kind of my role. I guess the other comment I'd make too is the change I've seen over the years also is the looming disclosure requirements. The fact that you've got TNFD created, you've got TCFD, you've got more disclosure coming our way, which I think is going to drive capital into this space more as companies and organizations look to contribute to nature positive outcomes. That's from my perspective. Thanks, Bridget.
Terrific. Thanks, Rob. And for those that aren't familiar, there's going to be some acronyms flying around: Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures and Carbon Disclosures. So that's just folks that are needing to report on the impact they have and looking for projects that can help offset or contribute to that impact. So thanks, Rob. That's an important driver for sure. I'll turn it over to Val to provide some opening thoughts.
Thank you so much, Paige, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. I'm joining you from my home in what is now known as Goose Bay, but what I know better as Ntasinan, which is our traditional territory as the Innu people. I'm a member of the community of Mistuyats, which is the westernmost Innu community, and I just happen to be in the kind of the eastern end of Ntasinan now. As Paige said, I'm the executive director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, which is essentially the only national scope Indigenous-led conservation organization in Canada. Our goal is really to strengthen nationhood because strong Indigenous nations will make strong decisions on lands. And for anybody who's been tracking the history of rights assertions in this country's, most of Indigenous land claims or court cases revolve around the role of decision-making on lands and the conservation of our ability to continue to be who we are in these territories. As an Innu person, we are a caribou species, a caribou people. And for anybody who knows caribou, they know they can travel over 90 kilometers a day. So it takes a lot of land to be Innu. Why does this matter? Well, not only is there kind of an inherent ethic of conservation within many nations, it is part of our laws and understanding of our place in the world, that responsibility and reciprocity that we have with our landscapes. But in fact, there are more proposed Indigenous protected and conserved areas in what is now known as Canada than any other form of conservation active today. In fact, there's over 500 million square kilometers in active proposals being worked on now. Many of those areas are managed by stewardship programs that we like to call guardians. And in fact, there's over 160 programs in First Nations alone, which means that on any given day, there's over 1,000 guardians who are actively managing and ensuring the continuity of these spaces. Luckily, many of these areas are also on carbon-rich land. Of course, for those of you who know, the boreal forest is the largest terrestrial storehouse of carbon on the planet. In fact, it stores twice as much as tropical forests per hectare. And so if Canada is going to play its leadership role at a global level, it really needs to conserve these spaces that are absorbing carbon and doing that at a proven scale, unlike many of the technological kind of solutions that we're exploring actively today. Maybe I'll leave it there, Paige, and I look forward to the continued conversation.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Val. That's a great introduction to just a tip of the iceberg, as it were, some of the work that you guys are up to, but also the importance of centering Indigenous leadership in all of this. Daniel, I'll turn it over to you to provide a bit of context in the way that you've worked in the conservation finance space.
Sounds good. Thank you, Paige and Kearney. I'm really enjoying your moderating superpowers, and the panel has just started, and I'm learning a lot. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm gonna, as you said, I'm gonna share with the audience, the panel, my experience in the conservation finance sector, and perhaps what actually attracted me to this sector, and is the opportunity that organizations that have otherwise not been collaborating together have to actually create innovative ways to address some pressing challenges that our panelists have already described. My experience revolves around the work that I've done with an organization called Carolina in Canada, which is a network for ecosystem recovery that is bringing together more than 300 environmental organizations together and thousands of volunteers with the mandate of reversing the trend of habitat loss in southwestern Ontario, which is a dantesque and very complex challenge. So the challenge, of course, revolves around the availability of resources that organizations similar to Carolina in Canada or place-based organizations have to advance their environmental missions. So what ends up happening is that these organizations, of course, have to leverage and maximize very limited resources to address very complex, networked, and wicked problems, such as reversing the trend of habitat loss. And what's particularly relevant about southwestern Ontario is that the region over the last few years has actually transformed its natural habitats and ecosystems into agricultural, residential, or industrial land. So that's a very complex challenge that these organizations trying to face in working with private landowners and other organizations in a fragmented region and ecosystem. So through the Conservation Impact Bond that we launched in 2018, what we're trying to address is the notion of creating recurrent, predictable, and durable sources of financing to support this work. And we're going to go into the details of how we're doing this. But again, this is one of the challenges we're trying to face with Carolina in Canada, and very happy to share more information about it.
Great. I'm sure there will be questions, Daniel. Thanks. For folks that have read about this Conservation Impact Bond, it was sort of a first of its kind, innovative in the way that they've been tracking information, engaging with Indigenous community and Indigenous knowledge that was part of the sort of core of defining success there. So yeah, I'm sure there'll be lots of things to unpack. I'll move over to Manuel to introduce himself and also tell us a bit more about Cultivo and how you operate, as you're the non-Canadian representative today. So you can give us a bit of an international perspective as well.
Delighted to be here, Paige, and thank you for the space. Well, on our side, Cultivo is a public benefit corporation that values nature. At the core of everything that we do is to value nature appropriately and make sure that we're doing it in the side by side with artificial intelligence, science, innovative finance, and partnerships. Those partnerships are core to how we deploy capital to nature. And those partnerships are with various types of landowners across now more than 20 countries. They are from small to large landowners, including corporates, and most of them are actually with Indigenous groups. We started working more than 4 years ago in North America, specifically in my home country in Mexico, with different types of Indigenous groups. And we are now, fortunately, also from the beginning working in Canada, although I will this is my teaser moment of how I think we should do more in Canada, because the natural capital potential that Canada has and the ways it has to unlock it are fundamental to the types of capital, of natural capital where catalytic capital wants to flow. And so one of the elements that I wanted to share, just from our point of view, is that similar to what Courtney shared, coming out of COP, is that more than ever, we're seeing different types of capital moving and wanting to move to nature. This is really moving beyond the pledges to true products that are already starting to land different pools of capital, both on an equity perspective as well as fixed income or permanent capital into the space. So back to what Cultivo does is that our customers look through our platform to find distressed assets. So Cultivo focuses really on degraded ecosystems or degrading ecosystems, and how to bring financial institutions and corporations to deploy capital to those sites. Yes, it's all connected to the natural capital stack to be specific biodiversity gains, water gains in the right social context, then give us carbon removal potential. So if you want to put a specific carbon vision to what we do, is we're talking about nature-based carbon removal projects, but our various types of customers look at it from a materiality perspective. Rob mentioned TNFD and other driving forces like the EU's deforestation-free zone and different mechanisms that are driving more capital into space. But at the end of the day, what you have is capital either on an equity or a fixed income type of approach wanting to move into the space globally, but Canada is certainly in the target.
Great. Thanks so much, Manuel. I'm sure we'll dig more into that. And finally, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Day, who will be speaking on behalf of the BC Parks Foundation and also his length of experience in that region. And you can talk to us a little bit. I know there's been some big news that's come out of that area recently as well in terms of big infusions of funding and support. So it'll be great to hear your perspective on the conservation finance space in your part of the world.
Thank you, Paige, and thanks to everyone else on the call and my fellow panelists. So I think my interest and dedication in this space and why I find it so particularly exciting and compelling is it comes from being in some of the last unroaded and intact natural spaces in the world and witnessing the beauty and abundance of life. Clean air and water, rich soils, caribou, moose, lynx, whales, salmon, bighorn sheep, dragonflies, old growth trees. That's just some of the 50,000 species that make up the web of life that we share beautiful, biodiverse British Columbia with. And I just can't express how, being in those places is a constant source of motivation and inspiration. I'm very inspired by the First Nation partners that we work with, who, despite the impacts and pressures of colonialism, maintain cultural values and knowledge that understand that the land, the water, and the life in it is worth more intact than destroyed. And I'm very, I think we have a tremendous opportunity in British Columbia because the nations have recently agreed with the provincial and federal governments under a British Columbia Nature Agreement to protect 30% of British Columbia and restore and protect threatened species and ecosystems. And that's come with some large announcements and commitments from the federal and provincial governments towards funding for that. I think the other thing that I find really, that I consider myself very grateful and lucky to be a part of this is just the incredible dedication of people like you on this call. We have tens of thousands of supporters in the foundation, and whether it's the pensioner who gives us $5 a month, or the philanthropist who gives us 50 million, or the municipal government who gives us 150,000, or the provincial government that recently committed 150 million, it's the passion, the dedication, and the diversity of supporters that give us our strength and give me endless guidance and inspiration around this work. And I'm also just tremendously inspired by what we can accomplish when we work together. So we've been able to raise over 400 million in the last 3 or 4 years for nature and stewardship. We've been able to protect 30 beautiful places and work with British Columbians to collect over 25 million observations of nature, and also launched a national health program with doctors across Canada to reinforce the extent to which nature is not just an abstract concept. It's actually fundamental to our personal health and well-being, and our population health and well-being. So the last thing I'll say is, a couple weeks ago, we closed on a property, beautiful property, that will now be protected and restored to forever. And the day after we closed, a magnificent white mountain goat showed up on the property. It's the first time in living history that anyone has seen a mountain goat in this area. And I have seen that kind of strange, wonderful magic over and over. And it always gives me the feeling that if we do half, nature will do the rest. But we have to do half. Nature wants us to win. And when we come together on real projects and real places and genuine partnerships, we can. And that sense of possibility, that sense of what we can accomplish together when we come together is just, it's an incredible gift. And for everyone who's thinking about being involved, I really would like to invite you into this space, because it is pure magic. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy. I think you've set us on the right path for the headspace we all want to be in for this conversation. And it makes me think, there's this interesting situation that we find ourselves in. Then Canada is famous for its vast landscapes, tremendous intact nature relative to a lot of places in the world. And yet, referring to Courtney's presentation, we recognize that despite understanding how much nature is a foundation of so much of what we do and how we want to operate and experience, recreate and have a good time and spend time with family and friends, as well as being the, fundamental support of how economies function, it has been really challenging to raise and implement funding to restore, to conserve and maintain in the ways that we would like to, and to meet these various targets that we've set, et cetera. So that's a useful segue, I think, into a question that really is open to anyone. I had a couple of people in mind, because I know that Rob specifically and Andy, and as well as Daniel with Caroline in Canada, have been involved in certain types of conservation finance, sort of development, but Val has as well with the project finance for permanence, of course, and Manuel, this is his bread and butter, thinking out how these deals work. So a question to anyone, and maybe I'll just have you, folks jump in and others can jump in or raise a hand. But, given that it seems obvious, of course, we want to, be able to invest in these places and spaces. It is challenging. And so the question is, what are some success factors in various examples and cases that you've been involved in? Can you point to something that helped it cross the finish line, or, reasons why something was successful, that's something we can build on when we think about scaling things into the future? Rob, I see you've gone off mute, so you want to jump in?
Oh, okay. I hadn't intended to, but okay.
All right.
Sure, Paige. I think one of the things that really is being worked on is we talk a lot about the value of nature. So being able to quantify a lot of the co-benefits of nature as well, and making the case that it's not just price. Price is what you pay, but value is what it's worth. And those are two very different numbers. And I think, sometimes being able to articulate and demonstrate that the value of sort of ecosystem goods and services, difficult and challenging as that is, but that provides an enormous benefit to people that want to invest in projects. So certainly I think of examples like carbon projects, where a ton of carbon is easy to put a price on a ton of carbon. There's lots of market signals there. But the co-benefits, the multiple benefits from the ecology and the species at risk, that many things Andy just talked about, those are what attract capital, and that story is also really an important part of it. So being able to certify under standards that allow you to make attestations to that effect, and also demonstrate tangibly co-benefits that come along with some of these investment opportunities, I think is really compelling.
Thanks,
If I-
Dan. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. If I can add, Carolinian Canada, during the design stage of the Conservation Impact Bond, Carolinian Canada hosted roundtable conversations for a couple of years, bringing together environmental scientists, environmentalists, Indigenous leadership, and we hosted roundtable conversations with impact investors, with bankers, with consultants, with their service providers, trying to address that specific question. What is it that, so if on the environmental side, we know that we're generating all these co-benefits, what are we missing to actually attract you and your resources and your know-how to form a part of this collaboration mix? And obviously I'm gonna overgeneralize, but some of the principles that we started to think about more seriously and strategically in Carolina, Canada, were around the notion of scalability, of course, cost efficiencies, of course, because investors, and particularly private investors, invest the same amount of time and energy, from what we understood, on a project with that is worth, say, $500,000 than another project that is worth, say, $10 million. The same processes actually have to be followed in both cases. So obviously they're going to incline to, they're going to prefer the one that actually generates more, that converges more resources than the former. So that to us was quite relevant. Being able to attract those types of conversations were very important.
Manuel, you were going to jump in as well?
Yeah, actually, I'm now going to build on what Rob and Daniel mentioned, which is, I think that, and this echoes our approach to doing projects, which is that we firstly go through our technology, the potential of this distressed asset that we have in front of us for our customers, on decoding really that value for nature and those co-benefits. On, for example, what is the biodiversity gain or the water gain specifically to that site, and in what social context. Because that is then accounting to how much is it going to cost actually to authenticate the claims coming from those co-benefits. So how many new species are being accounted for, how many cubic meters of water per year are infiltrating to that specific aquifer. But at the end of the day, to the question that you posed at the beginning, Paige, is what really tips over that investor to pour capital into the project is going to be, as in, there's always this mental leap of, okay, now you've shown me, in our case, Cultivo through the platform, this is the natural capital that I'm going to be investing in. This is the expected return, IRR or MOIC or whatever metric they want to use for their specific financing product. But the driving force to selecting one project versus another as a starting point of a broader portfolio of investments in nature is how easy or complex will implementing that project be. So, for example, in regions, provinces or territories where there's a bit of track record, someone has walked the path to engage with the local province, so to make sure that the governance is set. Or if someone has already engaged with an indigenous group, or that indigenous group is already prone to have that type of landowner, land stewardship agreement, really makes that specific project where there's a bit of a trodden path already advanced, makes it the first one. It's not to say that then, oh, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. I don't think that's the case. The case here is that partnerships, hubs like the Nature Investment Hub can do is to start walking that path with the different provinces and territories, as well as landowners, to make sure that we're setting up what we're doing in other locations, of putting forward a series of blueprints that when we're speaking with an investor, we can say, look, if you're to invest here, this is how we engage with landowners, right? This is what core carbon principles, having the ethics, more acronyms, but basically are the landowner rights and land stewardship rights of sharing that benefit aligned with the long-term vision of restoring nature for not 20 years, but actually 100 years. And showing those templates from the beginning to an investor gives peace of mind and reduces the risk of an implementation component. At the end of the day, every investor, regardless of the type of capital that they want to deploy, will be looking at that risk-adjusted return. If we're showing that return with a natural capital potential, we really need to do as much as possible to diminish the implementation risk.
Great, thanks a lot. Good food for thought. And I'm curious, Val, on that same question of, kind of getting things across the finish line and success factors. It was a huge announcement to come out of the Northwest Territories about, investment and moving forward with the, very large scale protection that's happening there. And so I've sort of two questions there. One is about, why or how, what about that process you think helped it be successful? And then touching a little bit on something Manuel mentioned, but this idea of long-term funding, when we talk about IPCAs and PFPs, more acronyms, sorry, but, not just about the immediate, but thinking, in the very long term and why that's so critical.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paige. First of all, why long-term? It's actually a rarity. And if there's one thing that makes me lose sleep as the director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, it's that lack of clarity around what that long-term scenario will look like for our communities. The interest of the PFP is that, first of all, there's 26 different Indigenous governments involved on top of the territorial government, the federal government, and the donors who are involved in that initiative. It is unprecedented to have that level of agreement in this region. But it's not an accident that it's happening in the Northwest Territories. It's also happening in British Columbia, in Northern Ontario, and in Nunavut, in the QIA region. But in the Northwest Territories in particular, what we've found is that there was a history of leadership on Indigenous-led conservation models. So what we've seen come out of the Taidonanene agreement, where it's a mixed kind of federal park and territorial park areas, what we've seen out of Tuyeta, out of Adeji, these were the kind of the precursors and the early adopters of the Indigenous protected and conserved model. And part of what's interesting there is they've all worried about this very question. How can we make sure that these areas are financed into perpetuity? They've had different models, some more successful than others, but they were already down that path. So those conditions were there. The other thing to think about in conservation finance, though, is that it doesn't necessarily mean that every dollar should go towards a hectare of conservation. Sometimes it means that a shift in economic models. And what we've seen in many remote and northern communities and Indigenous communities is that often our leadership doesn't necessarily have the luxury of choices when it comes to development. The proponent shows up and says, I've got this amazing project, are you in? That's never asked in the context of multiple proponents having multiple opportunities where you can make the best of. You're trying to make that decision with the information that you have in front of you. And that's part of what I'm excited the most about the PFP, is that it's going to create a space of consideration where conservation becomes an aspect of future development, as opposed to being a withdrawal or some sort of cost exercise. And that's an incredible luxury. I can tell you that here in Labrador, we would be ready to do the same and think through not only what is the next Voisey's Bay mine or the next iron mine, but what is the future that will ensure our perpetuity culturally and economically as a region where we're lifting all boats. And then the other thing that I'll just say based on the previous comments about values, it's really important that we define whose values are put forward and whose perspectives are advanced and whose thoughts are we measuring? Because often what we're finding is that, it's not an accident that 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is on Indigenous lands. And that is because there are Indigenous values that are put forward in the decision making for these regions. And I would argue that the rest of the country and the rest of the lands would really benefit from those perspectives. Why does it matter that we're protecting the Caribou Master's house? Well, it matters because the Caribou Master for us is the central spiritual being that dictates the way that we behave on these landscapes. But I can tell you, if I were to talk to the provincial forester here in Newfoundland and Labrador and say, I want to protect the Caribou Master's house, he'd look at me like I had 10 heads. And so we have long conversations to have in these regions about why Indigenous peoples have those values. How does that then translate into behavior and laws? And how do we then codate them and put them in a format where all Canadians can benefit from those perspectives?
Thanks so much, Val. And I'll just add a quick point of clarification. PFP, Project Finance for Permanence. For those not aware on the call, it refers to doing large scale, not only protection, but basically economic development over an entire region that can allow for various sort of landscape level conservation and various types of activities. So there could be some type of managed forestry that happens within that area. There could also be different types of recreation and also what we might think of as more typical sort of conservation type activities. But by protecting at that landscape scale, it allows for the kind of economic development that Val's talking about, and also allows things to happen at a really large scale. And it is for that planning for perpetuity. It's sort of embedded with it. There's a financial model that can attract funding, at the outset, which is a way that you can attract different types of investors. But you can check out our website to learn more for some more details for folks that are interested. Andy, I wanted to turn it over to you. I think, did you have something you wanted to add or related to this sort of momentum around large scale conservation and what's happening in BC? I saw that you went off mute, so I just want to see if there's something you want to jump in on there.
No, I think everyone's pretty much covered it. I think the success factors are, alignment between First Nations and provincial governments or territorial governments is the key. Without that, there's really very little to work with, or a landowner if it's private land. But ultimately, I think it's, the ability to create success is the ability to move in a timely way with resources available. It's very hard. It creates a lot of uncertainty when there's a ton of process, a ton of dialogue, and just goes on and on and on. And when you don't have committed funders. So we've been able to move projects quite quickly when we have that alignment of values amongst the landowners, and then where we have the resources available to make things happen.
Great. So perhaps on that note, we did want to bring up the question of, when we're thinking about scaling investment, often we're pointing to private sector investment, but certainly recognizing the potential of public sector funds to help leverage investment. And, this new conservation fund in BC is an example of that. And also federal funds behind, PFPs and other activities there. So just a question about sort of the role of government. There's leveraging funding is one place for it. I know in Daniel and the work in the Conservation Impact Bond, government was an off-taker in part. And so, what are different roles that you see as important for government, and particularly in the Canadian context? And so, Manuel, maybe this is a way we can also get to some of the barriers or challenges that you found in Canada and how those might be alleviated, but I'll open it up to others to start.
Well, I'm happy to start on the elements where we see government action really helping unlock more investment. Is that, first one, especially when you're talking about just natural capital as a whole, is having a very clear definition by the government or the different governments across the different even tax treatment areas on how they're going to recognize land restoration activities and how they're going to promote it, be it through additional incentives, could be through a more positive tax regime, or just providing clarity. Sometimes in some of the jurisdictions that we work, it's not the case of Canada, but in some of the countries where we operate, I would say way more difficult to operate. The fact that the government can give a clear line of sight of, we're not going to expropriate projects that start to happen on land restoration activities, really changes the risk perspective for that country. Just basically a clear definition as to how the government will treat a land restoration project. Now, another very important point is that I think now very specific to Canada would be making sure that there are incentives that go beyond the project itself, right? So sometimes, like what just happened in South Africa, more loan tax treatments where perhaps capital gains to the land stewards can be reduced when a land restoration project happens. So that type of incentive really helps align both the government, the landowner, with investors to make sure that more capital is flowing to that space. But one that I think is very specific to Canada even further is just trying to unify as much as possible or provide clarity as to what protocols will be implemented at the provincial level or at territorial level as to how projects are going to be governed. And making sure that the project can then stand on its own 2 feet and is not going to be encumbered by sometimes strange and convoluted thing that is written below a mountain of pages within a government treatment of landowner rights. So in that case, what that allows is the creation of methodologies that are specific to what Valerie was sharing on, for example, how do you protect a specific ecosystem where perhaps the traditional additionality that it's seen from a carbon market perspective is not as clear, where most of the degradation is coming, let's say, from climate change or climate-related impacts. Could there be new methodologies that are specific to that ecosystem that show that, for example, the reintroduction of species will help continue to make that ecosystem bounce back and actually capture carbon? But the more that the governments provide clarity rather than noise on how they're going to treat these projects, I know it's a very simple ask. Can you please not provide any noise and just clarity? But it's a huge thing for investors to just know that where they're investing, there's a clarity and not a continuous shifting of the activity table is fundamental to this investment.
Rob, were you going to jump in?
I can just build a little bit on what Matt said. Great points about the government's role, but I guess one of the other pieces that they have a real role in is sending signals to markets. Like, so for example, putting a price on carbon has sent a very strong signal in Canada that, you know, it is creating a market momentum, whether it's a federal offset regime or a provincial offset regime or voluntary markets. But it's sent a strong price signal. This is important to us to put a price on pollution, and that is incentivizing capital to flow into projects that have these enormous biodiversity benefits as well, which is the great part about linking climate and biodiversity. So I think sending, you know, strong signals without being dictatorial in it is really helpful. And I guess the other thing I just mentioned is I think the government's also have a role in sometimes doing what the private sector won't do, and that's data collection and being better at providing, you know, for example, taking on flood risk mapping across Canada, being able to convey that information, or carbon mapping across Canada and being able to convey that information that, you know, it's not necessarily for the private sector to always do on a project basis. So that's just kind of two important roles, I think, is to, and I guess the other one is tax, as you say, creating tax incentives that also incentivize investment. So they've got a really strong role to play, I think, in this. Thanks, Paige.
Sure, I see Daniel and Val are both ready to speak up. Go ahead, Daniel, and then I'll turn over to you, Val.
Thanks. Just building on that last point that Robert mentioned in terms of offering signals and just creating the conditions to signal to the markets that there are emerging opportunities to adopt a long position in the conservation finance sector. That could be a pretty interesting and valuable role that the government can play. And I believe there's already a very interesting example that the government of Canada is playing in this manner. They recently launched the Conservation Exchange pilot, which is basically the idea of testing. It's providing government-issued certificates to businesses that are demonstrating leadership in terms of generating positive impact in nature conservation, generating leadership in engaging Indigenous, First Nations and Indigenous leadership, and also leadership in terms of biodiversity enhancements. So just agreeing with Rob on that regard. The other role that the government can actually play, and there's tons of examples as well, that the government is playing this role is in terms of catalytic support to innovative conservation finance initiatives. As you mentioned, Paige, they've played and they are playing that support to initiatives such as the Conservation Impact Bond. And it's just this idea of providing this support to environmental initiatives that are going through the death valley of cash flows, where there's, and Manuel mentioned this, and I believe Rob mentioned this as well, is this stage where these initiatives are developing their business models, their financial models, they're building trust, they're getting the all the permits and additional documentation that they need to secure from the public sector. Is during this stage of the implementation of these projects where environmental initiatives need a lot of support, or catalytic support, I suppose. So this could be two interesting ways in which the public sector can support conservation finance.
Great. Over to you, Val.
Thanks. These are all great comments. I'll just make a couple additional ones. One is the government does have a fiduciary responsibility for the First Nations in Canada, and so will always remain a portion of that solution space. But the building trust piece is something that's really, really important for us. And we've got a history of an Indian Act that is by design a piece of legislation that is built upon the lack of trust. And the signals that we've gotten in the last few years about things like the principles, the 10 principles that were put out by the Government of Canada on the relationship with Indigenous peoples, the offloading of responsibility. The Guardians Network is a great example of that, where we're no longer working and operating under a program dynamic, but we're more towards a true partnership model, are things that are essential. And investors need to see the value of making those investments, and Canada kind of leading the way and showing that it's a good thing is really important, because the absence of Canada is weird. People will say, well, wait a minute, you've got this piece of legislation, you're not doing it, why should I? And that's a valid question. The last thing that I will say is that Indigenous peoples in Canada, we have just as much interest of showing the values of these investments than the government itself does, because this is an avenue to achieving long-standing goals that we've had collectively. And so we've been doing that. We've been documenting those return on investments. We've been doing our best to show that they are indeed investments and not costs to the ledgers. And the more that we get signals from the federal government that they support that perspective, the better place we'll be for attracting all of those investments that we need.
I may just use this opportunity to build on a question that came from the audience before we get back to our, that was specifically for you, Val, and I think kind of ties into what you were just talking about. And so as they noted, I'll just read what they've said, that it's a philosophical question. To a certain extent, discussions of putting value on nature and efforts to calculate things like ecosystem services for the purpose of creating assets for conservation finance makes me uncomfortable and feels a bit icky and sad that it's necessary. And so is there a tension for Indigenous peoples around this issue as well, or a recognition that it's necessary part of conservation and protection? And, I think there's lots of folks that discomfort is present. So it'd be great to hear your perspective on that, and others may want to address it as well.
Thanks, Paige, and thank you for the question. The answer is absolutely there's tension. And it's not a perfect exercise, and I don't know that it ever will be. But there's an interest in us exploring that space, and to making sure that we find ways of financing our ambitions. Look, the average standard of living by Indigenous peoples is well below the standard for the average Canadian, and we have a right to enjoy the same levels of lifestyles as any other Canadian does. And so we've got a gap to fill, and Indigenous peoples have to find ways of creatively filling that gap. Now, we do have some principles around how this happens, and I've been referring to natural law or Indigenous law. I've been referring to our values. Those are innate systems of control around some of those options that we can lean on to do our best within what is obviously an imperfect system. But I appreciate the question and share your discomfort.
I don't know if anyone else wants to address that. And I see that Darcy from the RAD network that Courtney mentioned is also offering some further comments and links in the chat as well.
Can maybe I'll make one comment page on it too. I mean, I think when I'm talking about sort of coming up with valuation of ecosystem services, I recognize too that that's why I try to distinguish between price and value. Price is just something you'll pay for something, but we'll never get the price right. The value will always be enormously larger than the price we're likely going to pay for that flow of services. But it does send a signal that it's important, right? So, and that's kind of what I think, that's kind of what drives us, I think, is that nature is important and it provides an array of services that we'll never properly quantify. But let's at least acknowledge what the services are, and the few that we can start to quantify gives a sense, even if it's the avoided cost of not having to build a water treatment plant and using a natural watershed to provide that, to continue to provide those services. That's really an important message to the market, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Did anyone else want to? I saw some movement, but I wasn't. I'll give you a couple seconds to jump in. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question. I guess the only other thing just to add there, this is something I wrestle with as well, and often people kind of confront, don't have a problem with sort of traditional investment spaces, but then we're talking about something that feels as sacred as nature, that there are a lot of questions around it, and I think it is a challenge that we're operating in a system that doesn't reward or allocate or things don't count in the way that we want them to count, that don't reflect those values like the way that Val is talking about them. And so it is in the absence of that we are trying to sort of find a way to operate in this space so that we can signal and find ways to bring folks together to fundamentally support financially things that we know do inherently have value. And bring the right partners together to do that. Andy, just on the success points, given these recent announcements out of BC, is part of it a shift in values, or like why, and I'm referring specifically, there's, multi-million-dollar funds that have been announced, and fortunately also some agreements that you alluded to, is it just momentum, or what do you attribute some of these big announcements to and successes at West?
Well, I think it's core to our identity as British Columbians, and particularly, as I mentioned before, with Indigenous people, it's just such a deep part of their culture and ways of knowing and interacting with the world. And I'm not speaking for them, but that's what I've heard a lot from elders and groups that we work with, and that is not only within Indigenous communities, it's within many British Columbians have a very deep connection to places and to and have a deep sense of desire and social responsibility and goodwill to keeping those places intact and beautiful forever and passing them along. Better than how they found it. So I do think it's fundamentally a value. I think as a global society, we're really struggling right now to transition from the industrial revolution era to the digital era, and that's a very big shift in the way we think about and relate to the world, and as Val mentioned, I mean, we're trying to balance, the values of the places that we connect with and that we live on and with, and then the need to meet our own, needs and we know we can't do that in the way we have over the last few hundred years, but we also know, we're in a totally, very modern situation, right? We're not, it's not like any other time in history where the technology, the way we live, everything about our society and our economy is changing in a huge way. So we have to come up with new new things. That I like the concept of two-eyed seeing that was mentioned. You know, I think it's really learning from and building on the knowledge and the values that Indigenous people had, and then thinking about how we bring those forward in a very modern context. And we're all grappling with that, and we're grappling with that together. And that's what I find exciting about this work. It's very challenging, but it's exciting to have, you know, to sit with an elder and with a, you know, somebody who's coming from the world of finance, and a young person, and you know, a government official, and all be at the table trying to come to an agreement that's a real agreement that says, if these things happen, we will put in money, we will protect this land, we will do X, Y, Z. Getting that agreement, and then being able to release, you know, not only the funds, but the community will, and the desire and the passion and all the capacities to make those things real on the ground, for animals and communities. So yeah, I think that's, you know, Val mentioned other places in Canada. I don't think it's uniquely British Columbian. I think there's lots of places in the world right now who are trying to do that. I just think in British Columbia, we've had a wonderful alignment of lots of voices moving in this direction, and a real sense of the opportunity that exists as we transition from a resource-based economy to a new economy.
Great, thanks. And so I guess in the spirit of transition, a question I had for everyone on the panel is it related to, you know, sort of moving forward and into 2024, you know, in your own work and how you approach or address conservation finance. What is a top priority that you have in the coming year or years, depending on how you're approaching it? But if you could just speak to either what you're looking forward to or something that you really would like to see happen. And I'll start if anyone wants to jump in. Otherwise, I may turn to Manuel if he's just at the top of my screen. If he's ready to go.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Ready to go. So look, for us, 2024 is one where, just to give an idea to the audience at the scale that we're trying to achieve. So Cultivo was formed about 4 years ago, officially back of a napkin idea about 6. But we now have in our platform more than 100 million hectares of degraded assets, where capital is going to start to flow more and more to them at a faster pace. So what we're aiming is that, similar to the Nature Investment Hub, we also have a North Star, and our North Star is to be able to get to 1% of the total forest land mass, 150 million hectares, under regeneration by 2030. So 2024 for us is going to be the year where we're starting to put now from the hundreds of thousands of hectares to the millions of hectares under regeneration. And to do that, what I'm looking forward to is that we started to secure partnerships with those groups that already have the trust on the ground, from the indigenous groups to the NGOs that have been engaging with them for a very long time, to make sure that capital moves to them at the speed of trust. We're in no illusion that we're going to be able to create that trust in about a year or 4 years. But actually, we want to leverage the trust that has already been developed with those organizations with boots on the ground that can help those land stewards implement those regeneration practices. The other element that I think echoes a lot of the topic that I think is underpinning everything that we've discussed is how we continue to have richer data sets that prove that those implementation practices are real. And they're going to be there for the very long time spans that these investments are going for. So we continue to enhance the amount of time that it takes, as well as the detail of the data, to make sure that we're gathering more ground truth variables on biodiversity, even what it means to, I think people 2 years ago were really concerned about how we were going to monitor biodiversity. I would say that the most complex task that we have in front of us is how to actually have a social baseline and social data points that we can actually trust and believe in terms of that impact. So 2024 will be basically the amalgamation for Cultivo on all of those natural capital data streams being authenticated in the context of social to make sure that the scale of this project continues to increase. And so really looking forward to those partnerships, as I said at the beginning of the panel.
Great, thanks. Maybe I'll turn over to Rob.
Sure, Paige. Maybe I just mentioned a couple of things that are sort of immediate to us. We work across all ecosystems, obviously across the country, but certainly a big focus of us right now is on the grasslands too, and how do we conserve native tall grass prairie. Arguably one of the most threatened biomes in the world by far. We've lost over 80% of it in Canada. And the rate of conversion is outpacing the rate of conservation continues to. So, you know, we're undertaking sort of a prairie grasslands action program, which we're hoping to conserve 500,000 hectares by 2030. And we really have to work with a whole variety of stakeholders and working with the ranching community and the livestock farming community as well to try to incentivize sort of best management practices and really help incentivize them for the work they're already doing to conserve biodiversity and then doing more of it, which also involves restoration of prairie grasslands as well. So that's a big focus for us. And this is an example of being very, very collaborative and working across the whole stakeholder group, right? And that includes Indigenous-led programs as well. So it's, yeah, that's kind of an exciting thing to try to, you know, scale that up across the country. So that's one of our big focuses, I think, for in the current year. Thanks.
Great, thanks. I'll go to Val and then Daniel and then Andy. About 2024 and what's coming up.
Well, hopefully in the first quarter of 2024, we should arrive at a final agreement for the Northwest Territories Project Finance for Permanence Initiative, also known as Land, Life, Water, I believe is the new title. And because PFP, we've been working at it for 4 years and we still get the acronym wrong. So don't worry for anybody who's on the line. So we're hoping that will, well, in many ways, it'll be the single largest terrestrial contributor towards the 30%. One, two, we hope that it'll be an example for other regions to consider that, in fact, if you're thinking about large scale conservation, it's not a site by site effort. I mean, there is a space for that site by site, particularly for high intensity biodiversity areas. But if we want to achieve these targets and these commitments and be the beacon of leadership that I think Canada can be at a global level, we've got to catalyze things and we have to do things at a much larger scale than we've been doing. And I hope that in so doing, we will demonstrate the values of those investments, because we do have a few regions in Canada that are resisting the movement of conservation. And I'd like to see those regions really show and see the value of good things happening, and that in many ways these can be much better in the long term than short-term candies that are in front of some of the leaders today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Val. Daniel?
Thank you, Paige. So the priority for 2024 for Carolina and Canada is to continue consolidating the work the organization has advanced for the last five years or so through the Conservation Impact Bond, which is bringing together non-traditional stakeholders through conservation finance. The ultimate goal of Carolina and Canada's Conservation Impact Bond is to improve habitat in 400 hectares or 1,000 acres in southwestern Ontario. We launched the CIB, the Conservation Impact Bond, in 2019, targeting around 150 acres and blending $500,000 of seed funding and private capital to support a portfolio of habitat initiatives with the leadership of and partnership of Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Thames Talbot Land Trust, Verge Capital, SVX Capital, Ivy Business School, and 3M Canada. In 2021, Carolina and Canada launched its second pilot offering, targeting 250 acres, mobilizing around $1 million in blended finance with the catalytic support of Environmental and Climate Change Canada, 3M Canada, Dragonfly Ventures, the cooperators, and other extraordinary partners. So again, the goal for 2024 will be to build on these existing partnerships and trust. And the organization is in active conversations with a number of stakeholders to launch a third offering in the Niagara region, all to build towards the restoration and enhancement of habitat targeting 400 hectares or 1,000 acres across Southwestern Ontario, and creating this very diverse portfolio of different landscapes, different partnerships, and different offerings as well. That is the focus for the upcoming year.
Great, thanks. And then over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Paige. So we are committed to trying to reach 25% of BC protected by 2025 on the way to 30% by 2030. So for that to happen, we have a number of milestones and agreements that need to be reached in the next year. We're very excited to continue to work with First Nations and provincial government on a variety of projects that we've started to work on, and to reach some key agreements there that will get us that much closer to 25 by 25, and then to attract new financing in to make those agreements happen. I'm particularly, I think, also really excited for the momentum that the new $300 million fund that we've laid out will build. And so we'll launch that fund in June of 2024. And again, that will help achieve the 25 by 25 targets on the way to 30 by 30.
Terrific. We're just about at time, and we've made it through most of our questions and a couple of the audience questions. There's a couple quick hit audience questions that I'll just ask very quickly for any panelists to address, and then I'll turn it back over to Courtney. And one is about blended finance, about the state of it in the Canadian context. So are there opportunities and challenges to leveraging blended finance? And so I might turn to Daniel, given that blended finance is part of how the Conservation Impact Bond came about, or Andy, given that blended finance is a piece of how this new fund has emerged, if there's just any thoughts about, or others want to jump in about whether that's been, the question also included family offices and some of the other sort of philanthropic participants. If there's, we haven't talked a lot about some of the broader philanthropy space in Canada. If anyone had any quick thoughts about blended finance in Canada that they wanted to add. Sorry to throw this in at you at the end.
Paige, do you want to just define blended finance for those who don't know what it is?
Sure. So blended finance is usually referring to when you're trying to make an investment sort of more attractive, that you might have a range of, or if you're trying to bring in private finance, so that you might have public finance that comes in first, or that might have different terms so that you can bring in different types of private investors that might or other investors that wouldn't have otherwise participated. So sometimes it's a public-private partnership. Sometimes it can be in the form of philanthropy, providing the initial sort of what they call first in, last out, or so that they can, reduce the risk for other types of investors. Because on the spot, not my best definition, if other folks want to add in.
I would say yes. There's a big interest of organizations such as Carolina Canada to engage blended finance partnerships, particularly around the notion of, again, supporting those stages where partnership development, trust building, business planning come in the very early stages of these types of initiatives. We're talking about decade-long types of projects. So these organizations, similar to Carolina in Canada, environmental organizations, need to have access to reliable, sustainable sources of funding. One of the main reasons why we explored launching a conservation impact bond was precisely to find ways to address the very challenging changes in the funding landscape for environmental organizations, particularly in Southwestern Ontario. We gain inspiration from existing impact investing models that the social impact sector was actually implementing and advancing. Particularly, shout out to Pillar non-for-profit network. And they were actually advancing and designing and launching very interesting social innovation initiatives and social finance. So we drew from these examples, and we tried our best to integrate these lessons learned or best practices from the social impact sector to advance environmental impact and outcomes. So in some, yes, there is a strong opportunity for blended finance partnerships to actually play a role in the sector.
Yeah, and just to summarize really quickly there, and we've seen in the US and other international examples, often it is philanthropy, in particular large private foundations that are putting money in for capacity building or some of that early data needs or proving a case as possible, that then, as Manuel mentioned, that once that path has been tread, then others become interested or feel less risk averse to participating. So there's a variety of ways, whether it's public dollars or philanthropic dollars, that infusing other types of funding can leverage other dollars and other investors, as we saw in some of the matching funds that have been created. And Val mentioned Tai Dene Nene also. There was public dollars used to leverage external funding to create that trust fund as well.
Yeah, in our case, the fund that I mentioned, the $300 million fund, so $150 million is available in public funding, government funding, to match any contributions that come from the business or philanthropic sector. And I think, we're also looking at, in terms of the long-term funding that Val mentioned earlier, once an area is designated, that's where it's the funding for the long-term stewardship and maintenance of those areas that's going to be so critical. And that's where, we're looking at things like carbon finance that Rob mentioned, or the development of conservation-based businesses or those kinds of things within communities. It's not going to be, one source that's going to make this work. It's going to be multiple diverse sources that make it strong and sustainable.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Andy. And I think that's a great place to pause the conversation. I'll turn it over to Courtney, but I really want to thank the panel. I'm sure she will as well, for these great insights, and for the audience that during the holidays is also stuck around to hear from all of you.
Thanks, Paige, as well as Val, Andy, Manuel, Daniel, Rob, of course. So it was a very, very enriching discussion. And I'd say you've left us all with a lot of insights to digest, and, really taking away from this conversation the various roles that actors across the ecosystem can play. I think you've touched on a number of those throughout in response to Paige's questions. Also, that need for more data and the ability to tell a good story about demonstrating the value of investment, and the importance of building trust and relationships and understanding as we move forward. Feeling particularly energized by your responses to the last questions. And Val, I especially love your acknowledgement that Canada can become a leader in this space. And at the Nature Investment Hub, we're really looking forward to working with you and other leaders and organizations from coast to coast to coast in 2024 and beyond to deliver on our shared priorities and our aspirations. And so if anyone who is watching this has questions regarding how the Hub will support change in this area and support us delivering on a shared vision, please, I invite you to send these to us via email. We'll drop information in the chat right now, and it'll also be displayed in a moment. We will also be following up and sharing this recording with you in case you would like to revisit it, or perhaps there are people who you know couldn't join but would be interested to hear the conversation that's went on. In this email, we'll extend an invitation to you to have a conversation with us about how you might be interested in engaging with the Hub. And before we close the call, I know that there will be a post-event evaluation survey that will pop up. We appreciate your feedback to help us improve upon events like this in the future. And again, want to say thank you to everyone, to our esteemed leaders on the call. Paige, thank you for facilitating that conversation. Kiana and Kristen, who are operating in the background to make this all function, thank you. Really wishing everyone well for the holiday season, and talk to you soon.